Welcome to the Cold and Dark Start tutorial for the Antonov AN-225 for MSFS. We're going to run through the entire procedure as per the checklist from start to finish at the apron just for demo purposes, but I will explain as we go through the procedure at what point you should taxi out to the runway. So let's go. First off, we'll head to the engineers panel on the right hand side at the back of the cabin, and we're going to switch the batteries on. With the batteries on, we'll now switch on the APU1 fuel heater. Once the fuel heater is on, we'll switch on the APU1 fire loop. With that done, we can now switch on the APU left bleed air switch, and we'll now unguard the APU1 master switch and switch on the APU1 master. There is an APU starter button which we'll need to unguard, and we'll hold that down for 1 second. We'll monitor the APU start, and once this needle reaches the top of the dial, the APU has started. Once APU1 has started, activate APU2 fuel heater, and we're essentially repeating the process here, so APU2 fire loop, followed by the APU2 bleed air switch, and we'll unguard the starter and the master switch, switch on the master, and hold down the starter for a second, and then once again we monitor the APU start, and we'll know it started once that needle reaches the top of the dial. Returning to the engineers panel here, we'll switch on the rectifiers and check that the switches below the APU generator indicators are as shown here. We'll now rotate round and we'll look at the left engineering panel. Here we're going to turn on all the instrument master switches. With that complete, we'll head up to the overhead panel and we're going to switch on all the functions that are shown here. These are all explained in the checklist itself in the simulator, but they're various instruments for the pilot and the first officer. We'll now repeat this process on the first officer's side, slightly different switches, but all important instruments that need to be activated at this point in the procedure. And once more on the overhead panel, we'll switch on the nav lights. We're going to check that our engine fuel valves are all set to the open position, and on the panel behind the first officer's seat we're going to unguard the hydraulic pumps and switch them all off. Moving once again to the right engineers panel, you want to check that the fuel valve switches are in the configuration shown here. This should be the default configuration when you're starting from cold and dark, but I'm showing the entire thing here just so that you can check it and make sure there's no issues or switches in the wrong place. Once again, return to the overhead panel and activate the beacon lights. So on this panel behind the first officer's seat, unguard the engine start cover and check the position of the mix ratio switches and the starter mode switches. They should all be in the up position by default. Now switch on the digital engine controller, which is located just above that panel behind the first officer's seat. Returning to the panel itself, we'll now switch on the auto sequence start button, and we're going to hold the engine starter switch in for just over 1 second. On the right engineers panel, you'll be able to monitor the engine starts. It does take a little while, but the end result should look like this, and you should have no errors shown on the panel above. Returning to the panel behind the first officer's seat, we'll now switch on all the hydraulic pumps and you'll see the indicators come to life. And once again on this panel we can close the engine start cover. Looking now at the right engineers panel again, we'll switch on the engine generators. And on the APU panel, which is at the top of the right engineers panel, we can stop the left and right APUs. We'll also switch off the APU 1 and 2 fire loops, the bleed air switches for both APUs, and of course the master switches for both APUs. If we now check the GPS, if you press enter a couple of times you'll load into the main menu, and if you've planned a flight in the world map it will be present and correct on the flight plan page and usable once the IRS aligns, which doesn't take too long. We'll now set flaps 2 degrees for taxi and arm the speed brakes. Check that your nose wheel steering is working at this point, so the switches are to the left of the pilot seat. By default it should be absolutely fine. Now activate some lights on the overhead panel, and once this is complete you can taxi out to the runway. Once lined up on the runway, switch on the strobe lights and activate some more functions on the pilot and first officer side of the overhead panel. Again, these are all detailed in the checklists that come with a plane in the simulator. Finally, before takeoff, switch on the fuselage lights, and for takeoff you'll actually set the flaps to 35 degrees. And that concludes our start tutorial for the Antonov AN-225. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please drop a like, feel free to subscribe, take care, and I'll see you next time.